So last week I walked out to Easy E's, Boys in the Hood. Remember that? And I just had a conversation with somebody out there earlier who told me a story. He said, hey, I have a friend. Oh, no, it was his aunt. He said, my aunt, who is like staunch Catholic, never been anywhere but a Catholic church in her entire life, shows up last weekend. And I'm like, dude, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. She did say the message was great. She didn't know about that song. So if you're here for the first time, if you brought a friend, hopefully I don't have anything that is embarrassing to you that you're going to have to explain when this is all over. But we're in week 6 of this series. And what we've been doing in this series throughout the past 5 weeks and then again today is we've been looking at the different I am statements that Jesus made about himself. And they were recorded by the Apostle John in the book aptly named John. And what we've said is that it's one thing to know and kind of understand some of the things that Jesus did, but it's a completely other thing to know and understand who Jesus is. And it's truly understanding who Jesus is that's what helps us know how to have a relationship with him. And let's be real honest here. Our confidence in what Jesus has done or accomplished for us is rooted in who he says he is. Because if he's not who he says he is, then what he says he's accomplished for us doesn't really matter at all. Last week, we looked at the fact that Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. We talked about this gap, this chasm, if you will, between us and God. We used the phrase home last week, us and home. And whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, like you've experienced some gap, right, between whatever it is that you're trying to get to and Jesus. We believe that is God, that we're all trying to get to. Jesus says that he is what covers that chasm for us to get across. But if he's not who he says he is, then he can't be that for us. And so our confidence is rooted in who he says he is, not just the things that he's done or what we did or what he did. And if you ever want to catch up on some of the past weeks, you can always do that online or on our app. We have every week available on our app for you to watch at any point. One of the greatest mysteries of faith for me, one of the things that really keeps me up at night, I've asked this question more times than I can count, is why did God create the dung beetle? I mean, I'm sure you've asked that question, right, too? The same. I mean, it just keeps me up at night. One of the other greatest mysteries for me is this. What is it that makes suffering and hardship and tough times and testing, what is it that makes that affect people so differently? I mean, it seems like we hear stories all the time, over and over again, of people who we thought their entire lives were completely put together. They've got all the finances figured out. They've got all the stuff that they want, or at least the stuff that we want that they have. Their family looks super tight, or at least what you can see on the gram, right? They post it and put a filter on it and all that stuff, and it all looks so great. They got their faith all figured out. They seem to attend mass every week, or they show up to some church's gathering at least, and seemingly out of nowhere, this thing comes into their life and just completely takes them out. Everything comes crashing down, right? And right along with everything else comes their faith as well. They just seem to be completely disconnected. Then there's also all other kinds of stories where seemingly the same type of things happen to other people. Stories that we look at and we would actually say, like, man, if that happened, I actually kind of understand if you would like to throw in the towel. If you just kind of want to walk away from it all. Yet for some reason, those people, they seem to stand strong. More than that, they actually seem to come out the other side looking even better than when they started. They seem to have some sort of a stronger faith. They seem to be more in tune and more in love and more connected with Jesus than they ever were before. I mean, what's that all about? I don't understand the difference. Well, if you're a follower of Jesus, I'm quite sure that you've probably experienced both sides of that coin. I know I certainly have. At times in your life where things got difficult and you wanted to give up and walk away, throw in the towel, become disconnected from it all. And then other times where seemingly those exact same things happen in your life. But for some reason, they made you draw closer to Jesus. They made you seek after God a little bit more, made you feel more connected to him than you ever had before. And in the end, you saw some actually really cool things come out of it, some fruit come out of those times in your life. What's so different about those times? What is it that we can do to ensure that we experience more of the second side of that coin, if you will? I mean, you guys are all really smart people. Smarter than me, I'm sure. And I'm sure you've probably got it all figured out. You know the answer to how to stay connected and to experience the second side of that coin. But for me, thankfully for me and for some of us in the room, Jesus has our back. He's not going to leave us hanging. He's going to come with some clarity in this I am statement that we're going to look at today. In fact, so much clarity that I spent more time studying these verses than any verses that we've looked at so far. So much clarity that I prepared for this message for 12 hours on Wednesday and still wasn't finished. So much clarity that I kept reading and reading just to figure out what he was trying to say. But he says, I am the true vine. And we're going to look at John 15 today. Those are the verses we're going to be in. We're going to look at John 15, 1 through 12. And to give you some context of what's actually going on at this point. We looked at last week the I am the way, the truth, and the life. This was actually also all taking place over a meal. It was called a Passover meal. And if you don't have history in church, if you haven't been around before, you actually know what this meal is. This meal is also known as the Last Supper. The Last Supper, where we've got some long, flowing, haired white guys that were ethnic Jews, Middle Eastern, probably didn't really match up to me. Doesn't make sense. You know, where they all sat on one side of the table for some reason. That's the verse, or that's the meal we're talking about in these verses. The meal is over, and they've enjoyed their time together, and Jesus says, hey, let's go for a walk. I like to go for a walk after a meal. It helps with digestion, helps to lower the blood sugar. It's a good time to have a conversation, and that's what's taking place. Jesus says, hey, let's go for a walk. And as they walk, their conversation that they were having at the table continues. And we're probably about 24 hours away from when Jesus is going to be arrested, which is kind of the first domino of arrested, eventually to the cross, and finally to the tomb and the resurrection. And Jesus knows this. He's well aware of what's about to take place. In fact, just a few minutes earlier at dinner, Judas, who's sitting at the table with Jesus looks Judas in the eye, and he says, hey, whatever it is you're about to go do, why don't you go do it? Which at that point for me, if I'm Judas, I'm like, oh, you know what I was about to go? Oh, then I'm not going to go do that because you're obviously God. But Judas wasn't picking up on that. And so Judas actually goes with his 30 pieces of silver to go and tell them about Jesus. And he knows that because he's going to do that, soon he's going to be arrested. So all of this is going on in Jesus' mind. All this is going on at this point. He's thinking to himself, hey, I only have a few hours left. And so Jesus is trying to make the most important the most important. He wants to talk about only things that are super important at this point. And now that the one faker, the one guy who was faking the whole time, now that he's gone, Jesus is actually only speaking to the 11. These are the 11 that Jesus knows are actually all in on Jesus, like we talked about last week, that they've given everything, that they're actually true followers of Jesus. I think this is actually a very important point to keep in mind as we read these verses today. And so this conversation that we're going to read takes place somewhere between the upper room in the old city of David, where they were having dinner, and the Garden of Gethsemane. Somewhere along the way, Jesus begins to talk about vineyards and vines, and kind of the tone of his talk becomes very agricultural, which seems a little weird and a little out of left field, but if you know where this conversation could have taken place, it begins to make all sense in the world. See, it was roughly a mile walk from the upper room, or where they think the upper room was, to the base of the Mount of Olives, where the Garden of Gethsemane was. In fact, you can go there today and actually walk the path that Jesus likely took from the old city of David. You can trace the steps that he took to get to the garden. I've never actually been there before, but the people that have been there have told me that you can walk through David's old town, the old town of King David, through the Kidron Valley, and down to the base of the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, on his right were terraced hills that today are covered in houses and apartment buildings. Like I said, I haven't been there before, but I wanted to do the research, so I studied really hard to make sure this was true, and I watched a YouTube video. And it was a YouTube video. I thought I would share it with you today, but I'll save you from that. It was a guy that strapped a GoPro to his head and walked for an hour from the upper room to the garden, and it's looking like this the whole time. And so we can't watch that in here today, but just so you know, I did the due diligence of studying hard and watching the YouTube video. But in the first century, those hills would have been covered with vineyard after vineyard. Well, that would have been on his right, and flanking him on the left would have been the gates to the temple courts. Now, those gates would have been adorned with a golden vine across the sides and across the top. And it's at this point, perhaps, we don't know for sure, but I like to imagine that it's at this point that flanked on his right by terraced hills of vineyards and on his left by a giant golden vine, with the warm glow of a lantern flickering off the white limestone walls, that Jesus says what we're going to read today. And we read in John 15, verse 1, he says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. This imagery probably doesn't hit us today quite like it hit them back then in the first century. See, when Jesus says, I am the true vine, that is loaded with imagery for a first century Jew. See, throughout the entire Old Testament, the imagery of a vine was used to describe God's people, the Israelite people who eventually became the Jewish people. Yet when it was used, it was almost always used in a negative light. See, in the Old Testament, when Israel was described as the vine, they were described as the vine that did not produce fruit, and therefore the wrath of God was coming. And so in the first century, when a Jew heard the term vine, it was always accompanied with judgment. And yet Jesus is about to take this and turn it up on its head. And he says, I am the true vine. I am doing for you what you could not do. I am being for you what you could never be. This whole story is nothing short of a gospel presentation to these guys. See, he's entering into this banner of failure over their lives, over their people's lives. And he's saying, I got this. I am the true vine. You on your own have not been able to be fruitful in a way that pleases God. You alone in your attempts at morality and self-righteousness and this idea of I'm just going to work harder to be a good person, you were never able to produce fruit. But I got you. I am the vine, and attached to me, you will bear much fruit. Goes on in verse 2. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. And by the way, if this is your first time here, we're going to read 12 verses. I'm not going to stop every one. We're going to pick up here in a little bit. We're not going to be here for 3 hours, just so you know. This verse 2, this verse is actually where I spent the bulk of my time studying this week, because this verse, there's a few different camps of translation or interpretation, if you will, on this verse. And honestly, I'm really fine with both of them. There's the opportunity in this verse to kind of look at whether or not Jesus was speaking to just followers of Jesus or those that follow him and those that don't. Or there's a few different ways to look at it. If you're a Bible scholar in the room, I would love to have a conversation with you. You can come up with me afterwards and debate me, but you'll probably win because I'm not that good. But I do have ideas of what I think this verse means. I believe that Jesus is speaking to followers of Jesus from this point forward in this passage. But again, the interpretation of this verse does not change the main point of this passage, and so that's why I don't mind talking about it. See, in the end, what Jesus has to tell us at the end of this passage has nothing to do with how you interpret these first few words. But if you'd like to talk to me about it later, we can definitely do that. You see, Jesus being the vine means a few things for us. The first thing it means is we should bear fruit. Now, it's how you define that fruit that begins to matter. If you define that fruit as external morality, as a head knowledge, kind of a cursory head knowledge, being able to check off a bunch of do's and don'ts in your life, then you're no better than the Pharisees. And that's not how Jesus defines fruit. So what is the fruit that Jesus is talking about here? I think there are a couple ways that in our lives we can produce fruit. The first way we read about in Galatians 5:22 verse and 23. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, which means patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. And I loved reading this verse this week and kind of studying a little more. I grew up thinking that the verse said, but the fruits of the Spirit are these. But when you go back and read, the fruit, singular, of the Spirit are all of those things. So you don't get to pick and choose. You don't get to decide that I'm just going to grow in patience. I don't really want to grow in love. I don't love people. I'm just going to grow in patience. No, actually, Jesus makes it clear that to grow in the fruit of the Spirit is to be growing in all of these simultaneous. And now when I just read this, I actually don't think there was anybody in the room who, when I read that, they just yelled out, nailed it, got it all figured out. I'm just going to go ahead and go home for the day. That's not where any of us find ourselves. Anyone who considers themselves to be a follower of Jesus, your pastors included, we realize that we're not where we once were, for sure, but we're not where we want to be either. See, the other area of fruit that I think Jesus is speaking about, fruit that happens in other people's lives. I think the fruit that other people experience through us, other people experiencing Jesus' love and his kindness and his goodness and his patience through us. See, if the first area of fruit, if it's personal, internal transformation that takes place in our lives. The second kind of fruit is more of a transformation that takes place in the lives of those around us simply by walking through life with us. If you're kind of an OG relevant person, then you would know this verse, or this phrase we used to say. We used to say, transform people, transform people. It's something we said for quite a few years in the beginning. We don't say it as much anymore. I'd actually like to say it like this today, that transform people impact people's transformation. You see, I don't think God produces fruit through you if you're not producing fruit. Transform people impact other people's transformation. And so that brings us to the second thing that Jesus being the vine really means for us. It means we should expect pruning. Now, why would God prune what's already fruitful? I think most of us know a little bit about agriculture, so we know that he prunes what's already fruitful so that we'll produce more fruit. God prunes those who bear fruit so that we can bear even more fruit spiritually, personally, and see more people's lives transformed by Jesus. You see, somewhere along the way, we began to believe that being a follower of Jesus was somehow, some way, some sort of fairy tale life, where there's no room for difficulty, no room for suffering or hardship, or no room for doubt in our lives, no room for pruning. And somewhere we started to think that becoming a follower of Jesus is simply just a singular moment in time where we put our faith in Jesus, and from that moment forward, everything's just great. Instead of this lifelong journey where we wrestle with doubt, and so we cling to the cross. Or we wrestle with understanding of what God wants for us, and so we dig in to the Word and we grow. Really, it's sometimes just one difficult step of faith after another, believing that He has got this. This idea of utopia in life today, it's never found anywhere in here. See, God prunes and we grow. He prunes and we grow. He cuts back and we grow. We struggle and we lean into Him and we grow. We suffer loss in our lives and we find peace in Him and we grow and we produce even more fruit. All of us who have followed Jesus for any real period of time, we know this. We know this to be true. We know that these times in our lives where we've gone through suffering or pain or loss, that in the midst of some of the hardest times in our lives, that's where we've experienced the most growth, where we've felt the closest to Jesus that we've ever felt. That doesn't mean that any of us are like, yes, Lord, give me more. You see, as a follower of Jesus, here's what I'd really like to help you with today. If you're in a season of pruning, if you're wrestling with doubt and questions, if you're wrestling with understanding of what He wants for you, if you're struggling with a situation, if you have relational conflict, if there's a lot of fear and anxiety going on in your life, that doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It doesn't mean you haven't quite figured out the right formula for spiritual discipline. It certainly doesn't mean you're being punished. It means He loves you. He loves you. And He wants you to remain connected to Him and to see even more fruit produced in your life. We go on in verse 3. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. And this verse is so awesome. And it should bring nothing but comfort to the heart of the believer. Jesus is talking to His disciples. Remember the 11 here. And He says, you are clean. You're clean because you believed in my word. I have spoken to you, and you believed what I have spoken to you. You believed what I said when I said, I am the Son of God. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. I am the Messiah, the only one who could save you, and you believed. And it's because they believed, not because they did anything. I mean, don't forget, these fools are about 24 hours away from with cursed lips denying the fact that they even knew Him. And He was well aware that that was about to take place. Yet He still tells them, you are secure. This verse tells us that the moment we put our faith in Jesus, we become a branch attached to the vine, and we have everything within us that we need to bear fruit. This verse tells us that everything coming after this verse in this passage is about experiencing more of Jesus today, not just someday. Hopefully you're picking up on a pattern over the past few weeks. That the past few weeks, this week and next week included, that having a relationship with Jesus, truly knowing who he is about so much more than just having a get-out-of-hell-free card. It's about experiencing him today. And every verse going forward is about that, knowing and experiencing him. We go on. This is where it picks up for us. We're going to read verses 4 through 7 right here. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. See, one of the greatest supernatural mysteries of faith is really this idea of union with Christ. That somehow I am in him and he is in me. That I am in him and he is in union with Christ. And that works itself out in a couple of different ways. Mainly it works out in this way: how God sees you as a follower of Jesus. And I've said it a few times over the past few weeks that if you are a follower of Jesus, when God looks upon you, he sees the perfect obedience of Jesus. He doesn't see your failures or your shortcomings or your sin. He sees Jesus and his perfection when he looks upon you, and that's astounding. But this union, which is celebrated in a few different ways as followers, it's celebrated in communion when we take the bread and the cup, and it's celebrated in what we just watched over here in baptism. It infers this intimacy that we have with Jesus, that we are welcomed, wanted, and delighted in by Jesus. And that's so hard for all of us to believe because we know ourselves. We know and we understand that we are so undeserving, and so we kind of hide from that. There was a few years that Holly and I, we were taking crack or smoking crack. I don't know what we were doing, but we decided to homeschool for a couple years. If you are able to do it, God bless you. We were not. So a couple years is as far as we got. And I had this picture, this idea kind of this, and I thought like, hey, when I would come home from work, like when I'd come, my kids were still young, and so I'd come home and they'd run out and give me a big old hug and say hi, and we'd talk about the day, and it would just be a nice little moment. But if I came home and one of my kids wasn't around, usually Corbin, my 17-year-old, then I could guess that things didn't go so well with Mama that day. Things didn't turn out like he had wanted to or like she wanted to. And so he was probably in his room, putting on as many pairs of drawers as he could, just not knowing if I was going to come spank him or not, just waiting to see when Daddy got home. And it's that idea, it's that human nature that if we believe we've offended, we avoid. If we believe we've offended, we hide. And if we hide, we can't abide. If we hide, we can't remain. If we avoid, we cannot be connected. And so what's so stunning here is Jesus saying, if you remain in me and I remain in you, then you are welcomed and delighted in by the Father because of Jesus. There's no reason to avoid Jesus. There's no reason to try and hide. You cannot offend on such a level that you cannot connect with Jesus. It seems that so often that this is normal for us. We see this in so many people to think that they've got to get cleaned up. They got to clean themselves up before they approach God. And it doesn't play out like that. He doesn't ask you to clean yourself up to come. He asks you to come so that he can clean you up. That's what remaining in him is. That's what relationship with Jesus is. But if remaining in him, if staying connected to the vine, if that is key, well, then we better figure out how to stay connected. And thankfully, we get to read about that in verse 8. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. There's this cycle of dependence going on right here that I think because we don't quite understand, because we can't really grasp our position with God because of Jesus, that we read this text all wrong. We actually read it completely backwards. We read it to say as if, okay, I see if I obey his commands, then I'll remain in his love. But that's not what he's saying. That's not what he's getting at here. He says, if you remain in my love, you'll obey my commands. So it's not obey my commands, then you'll learn to love me. It's as you grow in your love for me, you'll obey my commands. See, when you get this backwards, you totally enslave yourself and step outside of what it means to be an Orthodox Christian, what it means to have a relationship with Jesus. See, being a follower of Jesus is not do, therefore you love. It's love, therefore you'll do. If you're married in here, if you're married anywhere, if you're married, you understand this. You guys don't understand. You gave me that look. Sorry, I didn't mean to single you out here. If you're married, you understand. Especially if you're a dude in here and you're married. I'll tell you, like at some point in your life, if you spend any time as a bachelor, you were fine when you would take your boxers off at night. You'd throw them somewhere in the direction of the vicinity of the room where the hamper might actually be. And that's fine. It's close. Then you get married. You get married and you start to get trained up a little bit, right? And at one point, early on in the marriage, your wife, honey, can you come here? What is this? And if you're not married yet, that's a trap, just so you know. It's like, do not fall into that trap. She knows what it is. Well, those are my boxers. Well, why aren't they in the hamper? Well, then she trains you up, right? She helps you understand that they should go in the hamper and you learn to do it. Well, then later on, like, you don't sometimes just take your clothes off that night and then walk back over to the hamper and think, you know what? Man, Holly, she hasn't been super easy to love today. I don't know, she's just been kind of a pain, kind of been in a bad mood, hasn't smiled much, and just haven't felt much love for her. So, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put my whole clothes in the hamper. Now I love her. Oh, so much love is filling my soul right now. It seems obvious, right, when you say it like a joke. But what we see happening in this last couple of verses here is that we're called to work on growing in our love for Jesus. And then in turn, that will affect and impact our obedience. Not work on our obedience in order to love, but grow in our love to straighten out our obedience. I think practically speaking, what this means for the follower of Jesus is that we should want to fill our lives with things that stir our affections for Jesus. Fill our lives with things that make us recognize him more, that make us appreciate him more, experience more of him, ultimately love him more, and simultaneously cut out anything in our lives that rob us of those affections. So kind of a good next step for all of us is to begin to be aware of the things in your life that stir your heart towards worship. What is it in your life that stir your affections for Jesus, that point your eyes towards him so you can have a working knowledge of how God created and wired you? See, what I'm convinced of this, I don't think there's any question about this, that for all of us, that will involve the Word of God, time in Scripture, and prayer. I think for all of us, those two elements are there. In fact, I've got a dear friend who's going through a time of what I would call self-imposed pruning. I think there's plenty of those times in our lives where the pruning that's taking place is because of something that he did and he knows it, but he's connecting with God on a level like he never has before because he's taking this time to say, you know what? I'm going to wake up every morning. I'm going to open my YouVersion Bible app. I'm going to go to the verse of the day. I'm going to go to my study for the day. I'm going to read my AA stuff because it helps point my eyes and focus my eyes on Jesus. I'm going to text my friends and let them know, hey, it's been 18 days. 18 days, here's what I read today. And in the end, I know that he is connecting with God like he never has before. And I believe in the end, we'll experience fruit that he's never experienced before. Outside of time and prayer and time in Scripture with God, we are all over the map. I mean, for me, good music stirs my affections for Jesus. the mountains, being in nature. I cannot be out in nature and not be stirred to worship the Creator. A great meal or a bottle of wine with friends, that stirs my affections for Jesus. I've been working with a friend of mine on Fridays. He owns a small carpentry business. I've been hanging out with him on Fridays doing some side work, and last few weeks he's been playing worship music while we've been working. I don't know if it's because that's what he wants to do or because his pastor's around. I don't really know. But I do know that he has said far fewer "that's what she said" jokes over the past few weeks. So it's infecting him in some way, and I can experience it. What is it for you, though? Like, it doesn't have to be any of those things. What is it for you that stirs your affections towards Jesus, that makes you point your eyes towards him and recognize him moving in your life more? Identify what those things are and begin to implement them and put them in your life on a daily basis. You'll experience more of who Jesus is. You'll feel more connected to the vine. We go on in verse 11. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Kind of what I wrote in my notes here, kind of the key for that verse is joy and happiness are not the same thing. One is very worthy of our pursuit, the other simply is not. Happiness is built on external circumstances and is extremely frail. We've all experienced, we've woken up happy, the right side of the bed, if you will. We've woken up happy, we've had our nice cup of coffee, and we've been enjoying our morning so far, and then we get in the car and we're driving to work, and the guy in the left lane is going too slow, and our happiness is gone. Or we read something on somebody's post on social media, and our happiness, it just breaks in our hands. Happiness is frail. Happiness is built on external circumstances. Joy is built on an ultimate, eternal spiritual truth. That you belong to Jesus. That he is for you what you could never be. He has done for you what you would never be able to do. That you never have to try and be anything other than a child of his. That's joy. And this matters because the God of the universe is serious about your joy. May not be all that concerned about your happiness. See, joy is your deep-rooted confidence that he loves you, that he has you, that he's for you, and that he's made a way for you. Jesus is the master preacher. He's a masterful communicator, and he's been teasing kind of his main point for these first 11 verses. Now finally he's about to drop the hammer, if you will. Finally about to give his disciples and you and I his ultimate takeaway. His ultimate main point of what he wants us to see when we read this. A main point that's woven throughout everything Jesus has taught, and yet we still waste so much time trying to look for some other meaning. Jesus has been saying, love me, obey my commands. Obey my commands, love me. Man, there must be so many. There must be so many. I hope we can do it. But he tells us in verse 12, my command is this: love each other as I have loved you. And there you have it. Plain as day, over and over again. So who am I to give some better main point than Jesus gave? Our big idea for the morning is this: we remain connected to the true vine by loving Jesus and loving others. We remain by growing in our knowledge of who Jesus is, not just facts about him, which allows us to grow in our understanding of how to live in an intimate relationship with him, being confident in his love and affections for us, that in turn compels us to love others the same way that he loved us. So, if you're a follower of Jesus in the room, if you're a follower of Jesus watching online, I got to ask you this question. Are you remaining in him by loving others the way that he has loved you? Are you remaining in him by loving others the way he has loved you? And how has he loved you? Well, you were forgiven when you weren't forgivable. You were shown mercy when you didn't deserve mercy. Grace has been lavished upon you over and over, even though you keep doing the same things. You were loved before you loved back. Are you remaining in him by loving others the way he has loved you? If you're not yet a follower of Jesus in here, man, I'm so glad that you were with us today. But I mentioned earlier this idea of getting cleaned up before we come to Jesus. I mentioned this idea, the story of feeling like if you've offended, that if you've offended too greatly, that you can't come to Jesus. You've got to hide and avoid until you figure things out. Well, I just want you to know that's just simply not true. Number one, you can't offend on such a great level that you can't come. And number two, Jesus just wants to be with you and help you get cleaned up. Being with Jesus, experiencing more of who he is and seeing that fruit produced in your life is what it means to be connected to the vine. Would y'all pray with me? If you've yet to put your faith in Jesus, if you're here with us today and that you've never made that decision, but you feel something stirring in your heart to do that today, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to do so. You can pray a prayer like this with me. Just say, Jesus, I'm a sinner in need of a Savior. Jesus, would you come and produce fruit in my life? Would you come and help me know how to follow and live like you? I want to follow you for the rest of my life. Jesus, for the rest of us, I pray that we would know what it is that you're calling us to do, to change, to experience in our lives so that we might be more connected to you, that we might remain more connected to you, so that when the hardships of trouble of life, when they come and they hit us, that they don't take us out, that we can experience them as a pruning opportunity so that in the end we can come out producing even more fruit, looking even more like you. Jesus, we love you. We pray all these things in your name. Amen.